Okay, now we're going to look at another way to display input text on the labels. This is going to be the same task as we've already accomplished using the button. This time we're going to do it slightly differently. So it's a little more complicated than the first way, because the first way just kind of used one line of code within that button handle function. We're going to need to implement a couple more functions and call some other stuff, so we're going to need to access a library that we don't yet have access to. However, doing that is an easy enough task, and when I say more complicated, it's really not that difficult. It just requires a little bit more work than before. So this time, with using this way, we're going to use a phone keyboard to display the text when the enter key is pressed, rather than the button press with the button that we implemented before. Alright, so now we've seen the simple way to do it using just the one line. Now I'm going to show you a different, slightly more complicated way to do it. When I say more complicated, it's really not that much more complicated. It just is kind of accomplishing the same task in a different way using the phone keyboard this time. So we won't actually need the button for this part. We'll be able to use the phone keyboard itself to do pretty much exactly what we just did. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have to call a different element, and this is going to be the UI text field delegate. Okay, and this is the first one that's popped up on mine. I'm not sure if it pops up on yours, but it's the UI text field delegate. And this kind of allows us to, it provides a delegate for the text field so that we can actually perform some kind of an action with the text field. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the viewDidLoad function, and we're going to say that the text field or txt text field dot delegate equals self. Okay, so what this is doing is by adding this UI text field delegate to our class, this allows us to implement a bunch of UI text field classes that we wouldn't have access to before. Okay, so anything that we add up here, for example, the UI view controller class, by adding that, then that allows us to access all of the UI view controller elements. By adding this UI text field delegate class, it allows us to access the UI text field delegate methods. Okay, so these are methods that, or these are rather these are functions that are part of the library, but we don't get access to them until we call this particular class. Okay, and this is just saying that the text field delegate is a self, so that's the entire class, and we get to basically handle some of the functions that we implement, and it will perform the actions that we want. So the first thing we want to do is we want to do this function called text field should return, and I believe it's the second one here, text field should return. And we're just going to select that one, and as you can see, it kind of auto completes this method or this function for us. So, and just so you guys know, the reason I keep saying method instead of function is because I've been coding a lot in C# and in Java, and they are in Java and C#, functions are called methods, but they're basically the same thing. They just perform some kind of a function. So basically this will take in a, we don't have to call this function, this is going to be one that's kind of called by itself. And basically it's going to return true, it's going to return, or false, it's going to return some kind of a boolean. And it's saying should the text field return. And what we're going to do is we're just going to put in some code here that will basically just hide the keyboard once the enter key is pressed. So we're going to say text field, and that's this text field specified, not our txt text field up here. So that's going to be this text field, which is one of the parameters, and we're going to call text field dot, then we're going to go resign first responder. And basically what this does is it says that our text field is no longer the first responder, which means that the keyboard doesn't end up popping up automatically unless we tell it to, or rather the keyboard will disappear once the enter key is pressed, and that's why we say return true. So when this function returns true, the keyboard will basically disappear. And that's very nice because although for our app, I'm just going to decrease this so we can see our emulator as a whole. If we look at our app, we have this whole bottom half of the screen unused. But most of the time we'll have this kind of filled in with something. So unless we hide the keyboard kind of masks whatever is underneath it from about here downwards. And that can be a serious issue. So this is a good method to know. It's this resign first responder. Okay, so that's going to be return true, and then we're going to implement one other function, which is actually going to do the label to text assignment. And this is going to be called text field did begin editing. And in fact, instead of the begin editing, we're going to use the text field did end editing. And that's going to be the second one. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have that same code that we had in our button. We're going to go lbl label.text equals the txt text field text. And if we really want, we can force unwrap it, but it's not necessary. So again, the force unwrapping with this exclamation mark just ensures that we're kind of making sure that the text field has some kind of a text. Because if there is no text in here, if this value is nil, it's fine to have an empty string. It's fine if it's empty, but if this value is nil rather than an empty string, then we'll get some kind of errors. Okay, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So before we run it, let's kind of go over what's happening here. So we added in this UI text field delegate up at the top, and this just gave us access to a bunch of the methods for, or rather a bunch of the functions for the text field. So this gave us access to this text field should return and the did end editing functions. Then we did this line here in the view did load. And this just assigns the delegate for the txt text field to be itself, which is kind of this view controller class here. And then the other two functions we added in are these two. So the first is a text field should return, and we said the text field.resign first responder and then return true, which basically says that once the return key on the keyboard is pressed, we're going to hide the keyboard. Okay? And then the final function is just saying once the field did end editing, so once the return key is pressed, once we've finished editing that text field, then we're going to assign the label text to contain whatever the text field currently contains. So very similar, this function in particular is very similar to this one, except that instead of changing the text once we press a button, we're going to change the text once we press the return key on our keyboard. So let's go ahead and run our simulator to see how it's different. So we'll just press run again. And yeah, there we go. And it's just going to build it, so compile it, and then run it. Build succeeded, always a good thing to see. And just going to load up the simulator here. And let's just open it up. Okay, so same looking thing as before. Now, one thing to note is that I click on this field, but there is no keyboard that appears. So how can I possibly change my text and press enter on a keyboard that's not there? Well, there's a simple fix to that. So with our simulator selected, not our Xcode, but our simulator, we can see up at the top, simulator selected, we can go to hardware, we can go down to keyboard, and we can use, it says connect hardware keyboard. So we can even toggle software keyboard, and that brings it up. Now let's just go over the options that we have here. So first is uses the same layout as Mac OS, and that just ensures that the keyboard here is the same layout as our laptop keyboard, and that's fine, we want that. The second is going to be connect hardware keyboard. So what this does is instead of using the phone keyboard, in fact, I'm just going to leave that unchecked right now. So what this does is instead of using the phone keyboard, it's using the hardware keyboard, which is going to be the laptop keyboard. So the reason that's checked right now, and we can enter text using the keyboard, is because, well, it's because that is checked, and because we're using the hardware keyboard. If we leave that unchecked, then notice how as soon as we click on the edit text, or rather the text field, the keyboard pops up. Now, if I try and type in, I'm just typing random letters into the keyboard, nothing shows up. And that's because we're no longer using the laptop keyboard, we're now using the phone keyboard, or rather the emulator keyboard. So if we were to type in anything from here, we have to press the buttons directly. So let's just type in hello. And you see, much like a an iPhone, it comes up with these suggestions and everything. So if we do hello, and then if we click return, then we get hello being displayed there. And that is excellent. That is exactly what we want. So we can now do this in one of two ways. We can modify the input from here. So again, if we want to delete text, we have to go from here. So we can say, for example, instead of hello, let's say goodbye this time. So we can do it by displaying text, and I know it has the and some other words, and that's because of this extra string we added. So we can do it that way, or now we can do it just by pressing the return key. So let's just say something like mammoth. And then we press return, and we get the text displayed there. Okay, so I'm just going to minimize this and stop running it. And there we go. So we've now seen two ways to accomplish the same task, and that's really the beauty of coding, is that there are many, many different ways to accomplish the same task, some of them more efficient than others, and some of them use slightly different routes which might be more beneficial in certain situations. In our situation, we had the same task accomplished but two different ways. One was by pressing a button, and the other was by pressing the return key on the keyboard itself. Now the advantage to having the return key pressed on the keyboard is that we no longer have to have a button. So we could have completely ignored that button and not implemented it, and we would have been able to produce the same result. However, the downside is that if we're running it on the computer, we have to use the on-screen keyboard, which really isn't that much of a downside. However, it was a little more work to implement. We had to implement these two functions, write this line, and then add this, versus just the one line of code that we had in the press button action function. Okay, so there you have it. Two ways to accomplish the same task, which was just to take our text input, press the button, or press the enter or the return key, and then have it displayed. In this part, we just looked at another way to display input text on the label. So this was the same task as before, but again, just another way. So we implemented a couple of functions using the TextViewDelegate class. So we had to gain access to these functions by calling the UI TextViewDelegate, and we did this right after the view controller at the very top. So it's a simple enough task, just had to implement a couple more functions and write a couple of lines. So this also allowed us to use a phone keyboard to display the text without the use of the button, which was definitely an upside. So although it took a little more work and isn't quite as intuitive, it allows us to use just the phone keyboard rather than having to press the button. And this might be crucial when space gets kind of limited within your app and you don't have room to add in a button. We might need to kind of resort to using the phone keyboard and that return key. So our previous method used the button press to take in the input text and reassigned it. This way just kind of had this method that was called, this function that was called did end editing, and that just kind of, once a return key was pressed, the app knew that we ended the editing, and then it changed the text from the input text to the label.